The grand ballroom of Buckingham Palace sparkled under the crystal chandeliers as hundreds of guests mingled during the annual charity gala. Camilla stood near the ornate fireplace, her emerald green gown catching the light as she spoke animatedly to a group of diplomats and wealthy donors. Her voice carried across the room as she recounted what she claimed was a personal story about her charitable work in Africa. "I spent 3 months living in a small village in Kenya," Camilla said, her hands gesturing dramatically. "I helped build wells with my own hands, slept on dirt floors, and ate nothing but rice and beans. It was the most humbling experience of my life. The children there called me their guardian angel." The crowd listened with rapt attention, some dabbing at their eyes with handkerchiefs. William stood across the room, engaged in conversation with several members of Parliament, but his ears picked up fragments of his stepmother's tale. Something about her story didn't sit right with him, though he couldn't quite place what it was. Lady Margaret Thornbury, a prominent socialite known for her extensive charity work, leaned forward with interest. "How wonderful, Your Majesty! Which organization did you work with? I've done extensive work in Kenya myself through Save the Children." Camilla's smile never wavered. "Oh, it was a small local group. Very grassroots. I prefer to work away from the spotlight, you understand?" "Of course," Lady Margaret nodded. "And when was this? I don't recall seeing any press coverage." "2 years ago," Camilla replied smoothly. "I insisted on complete privacy. The Royal Protocol team was quite upset with me, but I felt it was important to experience authentic conditions without any fanfare." William frowned slightly. 2 years ago, he distinctly remembered Camilla being in London for most of the summer, attending various social events and garden parties. In fact, she had hosted a particularly elaborate dinner party at Clarence House that he had attended with Catherine and the children. Dr. James Harrison, a humanitarian doctor who had worked extensively in East Africa, joined the conversation. "That's remarkable dedication, Your Majesty. The conditions in rural Kenya can be quite challenging. Which region were you in?" "The northern region," Camilla answered without hesitation. "Near the border." Dr. Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly. "Ah, Turkana County? That area has been particularly affected by drought. The work there is indeed crucial." "Yes, exactly," Camilla agreed, though William noticed a brief flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "I've worked in that region extensively," Dr. Harrison continued. "The local Turkana people have such a rich culture. Did you have a chance to learn any of their language? Even basic greetings can mean so much to the community." Camilla paused for just a moment too long. "Oh yes, of course. The language barrier was challenging at first, but the universal language of compassion transcends all words." It was a skillful deflection, but William caught the evasion. He excused himself from his conversation and moved closer to the group, positioning himself where he could hear every word while appearing to study a nearby painting. "The well digging must have been back-breaking work," commented Ambassador Reynolds from Canada. "I imagine the rocky terrain made it quite difficult." "Oh yes," Camilla nodded vigorously. "My hands were completely raw by the end of each day, but seeing the joy on those children's faces when clean water finally flowed made every blister worth it." Dr. Harrison tilted his head thoughtfully. "That's interesting. Most of the Turkana region actually has sandy soil rather than rocky terrain. The challenges there are usually related to the depth of the water table rather than rocky conditions." William watched as Camilla's composure remained intact, but he noticed her fingers tightening slightly around her champagne glass. "Well, there were various terrains depending on the specific location," she said with a light laugh. "I'm not very technical about these things, I'm afraid." "Of course," Dr. Harrison smiled politely, but William could see the questions forming in the doctor's eyes. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Camilla weaving an increasingly elaborate tale of her supposed humanitarian mission. She described sleeping in a tent under stars she claimed were the brightest she'd ever seen, sharing meals with village elders who supposedly taught her ancient wisdom about community and sacrifice. "The most moving moment," Camilla said, her voice taking on an emotional tone, "was when the village chief presented me with a traditional beaded necklace. He said it was only given to those who had truly served their people selflessly." Several guests made appreciative murmurs, clearly moved by the story. Lady Margaret even reached out to squeeze Camilla's arm sympathetically. William felt his jaw tighten. He remembered that beaded necklace quite clearly. Camilla had purchased it during a shopping trip to an upscale boutique in Notting Hill, claiming it would be perfect for her ethnic chic phase. She had even joked about how authentic it looked, despite being made in a factory somewhere in Southeast Asia. "You must have photographs from such a meaningful trip," suggested Mrs. Patricia Williams, the wife of a prominent businessman. "I'd love to see them for our charity newsletter." "I'm afraid I didn't take many photos," Camilla replied smoothly. "I felt it would be intrusive to document such private moments. The memories are more precious than any photograph could be." "How thoughtful," Mrs. Williams nodded approvingly. "That shows real respect for the culture." William watched his stepmother bask in the approval of her audience, her confidence growing with each compliment. The lies were flowing more freely now, each detail more elaborate than the last. She described teaching village children basic English, helping deliver a baby during a difficult birth, and even mediating a dispute between neighboring families. "The village elder told me I had the wisdom of someone much older," Camilla continued. "He said my presence brought peace to their community in ways they hadn't experienced in years." Dr. Harrison exchanged a subtle glance with Lady Margaret, both clearly beginning to have doubts about the story they were hearing. William noticed other small signs of skepticism beginning to show among the listeners, though most were too polite to voice their concerns directly. "It sounds like you made quite an impact in such a short time," Dr. Harrison said carefully. 3 months really isn't very long to establish that level of trust and connection with a traditional community. "When you approach people with genuine love and humility," Camilla replied, placing her hand over her heart, "barriers disappear more quickly than you might think. I've always had a gift for connecting with people from all walks of life." William nearly rolled his eyes at this statement. He had witnessed firsthand how Camilla often treated staff members and lesser-known guests with barely concealed disdain when she thought no one important was watching. As the evening progressed, Camilla's story grew even more detailed and dramatic. She claimed to have helped rescue children from a flash flood, organized an impromptu medical clinic when supplies ran low, and even participated in a traditional ceremony where she was honored as an honorary tribal member. "The ceremony was deeply spiritual," she explained to a new group of listeners who had joined the conversation. "They painted my face with sacred clay, and I danced around a fire under the full moon. It was like nothing I'd ever experienced." William found himself growing increasingly angry, not just at the lies themselves, but at the way Camilla was exploiting the genuine struggles and culture of people she had never met for her own social gain. The worst part was how effective it was. Her audience hung on every word, clearly impressed by what they believed was her selfless dedication and cultural sensitivity. What they didn't know was that 2 years ago, during the time Camilla claimed to be in Kenya, she had actually spent her summer attending polo matches, shopping in exclusive boutiques, and hosting elaborate dinner parties. William had clear memories of her complaining about the heat during an outdoor event and insisting on air conditioning even during mild weather. The irony wasn't lost on him that while Camilla fabricated stories about sleeping on dirt floors and eating simple meals, she had actually been demanding the finest linens and cuisine during her real summer activities. As the evening wore on, William found himself in an increasingly difficult position. Part of him wanted to call out the lies immediately, but he also understood the delicate nature of such a public confrontation. The charity gala was meant to raise money for important causes, and creating a scene could potentially harm those efforts. Yet watching his stepmother manipulate the good intentions and charitable hearts of the guests made his stomach turn. These were people genuinely committed to making a difference in the world, and they were being deceived by someone who was using their compassion for her own ego and social standing. The breaking point came when Camilla began describing how she had promised the village children that she would return someday with supplies and continued support. "I gave them my word," she said solemnly, "and a promise to those precious children is sacred to me." Several guests immediately began discussing ways they could help support Camilla's supposed ongoing work with the village. Lady Margaret offered to organize a fundraising committee. Dr. Harrison suggested connecting with established aid organizations in the region, and Ambassador Reynolds proposed involving his government's foreign aid program. William realized with growing alarm that Camilla's lies were now potentially affecting real charitable efforts and resources. Money and attention that could go to legitimate organizations might be misdirected based on her fabricated story. As he watched his stepmother graciously accept offers of help for a project that didn't exist, William made a decision. He couldn't let this continue, regardless of the potential embarrassment or family drama that might result. The truth needed to come out, and it needed to come out tonight, while all these well-meaning people were still present to hear it. The question was how to expose the lies without causing more harm than good. William took a deep breath and began moving toward the group, his mind racing as he considered the best approach. He knew that what he was about to do would change everything, but he also knew that letting the lies continue would be far worse. The moment of reckoning was approaching, and there would be no going back once he spoke up. William approached the group with measured steps, his heart pounding, but his expression carefully neutral. He had decided on his strategy during the short walk across the ballroom. Rather than launch into an immediate accusation, he would ask pointed questions and let Camilla dig herself deeper into the web of lies she had created. "Stepmother," William said warmly as he joined the circle, his smile perfectly diplomatic. "I couldn't help but overhear your fascinating story about Kenya. How wonderful that you were able to make such a meaningful contribution." Camilla's eyes brightened, pleased to have William's apparent support in front of such a distinguished audience. "Oh, William, yes. It was truly life-changing. I was just telling everyone about the village where I spent those 3 months. 3 months, William nodded thoughtfully. That would have been during the summer 2 years ago, you said? That's right, Camilla confirmed confidently. How remarkable, William continued, his tone remaining conversational. I have such a clear memory of that summer. In fact, didn't you host that elaborate dinner party for the French ambassador in July of that year? A flicker of uncertainty crossed Camilla's face, but she recovered quickly. Oh, that must have been before I left for Africa. Time blurs together, you know. Of course, William smiled. And the polo match at Windsor in August where you presented the cup to the winning team? I have the photograph somewhere. You looked radiant in that yellow dress. The color began to drain from Camilla's face, but she maintained her composure. Perhaps that was after I returned. The transition back to royal duties was quite overwhelming after such a simple life. Dr. Harrison had been listening to this exchange with growing interest. Your Majesty, if you don't mind me asking, which specific village did you work in? I have colleagues throughout the Turkana region, and I'd love to follow up on the well project you mentioned. Camilla's smile became slightly strained. Oh, it was quite remote. I'm not sure it even has an official name on any maps. Even the smallest settlements usually have names known to the local population, Dr. Harrison pressed gently. The Turkana people have a rich oral tradition of place names. Perhaps you remember what the locals called it? William watched as his stepmother's confident demeanor began to crack under the gentle but persistent questioning. She glanced around the group, perhaps hoping someone would change the subject, but instead found herself facing a circle of increasingly attentive faces. The name was quite complex, Camilla said after a pause that went on just a beat too long. Very difficult for English speakers to pronounce properly. Lady Margaret tilted her head with interest. I've done quite a bit of work with African communities, and I've found that making the effort to pronounce names correctly, even imperfectly, is usually deeply appreciated. Could you try? We'd love to hear it. The silence that followed was becoming uncomfortable. Camilla opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, clearly struggling to produce any authentic-sounding name. Lorumukol, William said suddenly, causing everyone to turn to him in surprise. Isn't that what you called it, Camilla? I remember you mentioning that name. He had completely made up the name, combining syllables that might sound plausibly Turkana to the untrained ear. It was a test, and he waited to see if Camilla would gratefully seize on his fabricated lifeline or admit she didn't recognize it. Yes, Camilla said with obvious relief. That's exactly right, Laura McCall. Thank you, William. I've been so nervous about mispronouncing it. Dr. Harrison frowned slightly. Laura McCall? I'm not familiar with that settlement, and I've worked extensively throughout that region. Could you describe its approximate location relative to Lodwar or Lokachogio? The relief on Camilla's face evaporated as quickly as it had appeared. She clearly had no idea what those reference points were, and William could practically see her mind racing to find another deflection. It was quite isolated, she said weakly. We traveled for hours to reach it. From which town? Dr. Harrison asked. His tone remained polite, but William could see that the doctor was now actively investigating, rather than simply making conversation. I'm afraid I don't remember all the details, Camilla said, attempting to laugh off the question. The travel arrangements were handled by my security team. Ambassador Reynolds looked puzzled. Your security team would have required quite detailed documentation for a trip to that region. Kenya requires specific permits for travel to some of the more remote areas, particularly near the border regions. William decided it was time to apply more pressure. Speaking of documentation, Camilla, didn't you mention keeping a journal during your trip? I'd love to read about your experiences someday. Oh, that was quite personal, Camilla replied quickly. Not really meant for sharing. Of course, William nodded. But surely you have some photographs? Even if you didn't want to intrude on private moments, you must have captured some of the landscape or the wells you helped build. As I mentioned earlier, I felt it would be inappropriate to document such sacred experiences. How thoughtful, said Mrs. Williams, though her tone had become noticeably cooler. Though I must say, having some visual record would be invaluable for inspiring others to similar service. William could see that the tide was turning. The guests who had initially been captivated by Camilla's story were now exchanging subtle glances, their expressions shifting from admiration to skepticism. You know, William said as if struck by a sudden memory, I just remembered something interesting. Wasn't that the same summer you had that terrible bout of allergies that kept you indoors for days at a time? You complained constantly about the English pollen. Camilla's eyes widened in alarm. She had indeed suffered from severe hay fever that summer, spending most days in air-conditioned rooms and frequently canceling outdoor engagements due to her symptoms. That must have been a different summer, she said weakly. No, I'm quite certain, William continued relentlessly, because it was the same weekend as the charity cricket match, where you couldn't present the prizes because your eyes were too swollen from the allergic reaction. The newspapers even ran a story about it. The silence that followed was deafening. Several guests pulled out their phones, presumably to search for the newspaper coverage William had mentioned. Dr. Harrison spoke into the quiet. "Your Majesty, I hope you don't mind me saying, but your story has raised some questions for me. You see, I've spent considerable time in the Turkana region, and many of the details you've described don't quite align with the realities of that area." Camilla's face had gone pale, but she tried one last deflection. "Well, perhaps my memory has become a bit confused over time. The important thing is the spirit of service, not the specific details. But the details matter quite a lot when people are offering to donate money and resources," Lady Margaret said, her voice now distinctly cool. "If there's a village in need of support, we want to help the right community. And if there isn't," Dr. Harrison added quietly, "then we need to direct our resources where they're actually needed." William watched his stepmother's face cycle through a range of emotions: panic, anger, desperation, and finally, a kind of defeated resignation. The lies had become too complex to maintain, and the inconsistencies too obvious to explain away. "Perhaps," William said with deceptive mildness, "you could clarify for everyone exactly where you spent that summer 2 years ago? I'm sure there's a simple explanation for the confusion." All eyes turned to Camilla, who stood frozen like a deer in headlights. The ballroom around them had continued its elegant festivities, but their small group had become an island of tense silence amid the celebration. Camilla began, then stopped. She looked around the circle of faces, all waiting for an explanation that would make sense of the contradictions they had heard. The moment stretched on, becoming increasingly uncomfortable for everyone involved. William felt a mixture of satisfaction and embarrassment at what he had orchestrated, but he also felt that the truth needed to emerge, regardless of the personal cost. Ambassador Reynolds cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps this is a conversation better suited for a more private setting." But Dr. Harrison shook his head gently. "I'm afraid this involves potential charitable fraud. If donations are being solicited based on false information, that's a serious matter that affects all of us here tonight." The weight of his words settled over the group. What had begun as an elegant social gathering was rapidly becoming something much more serious. Camilla looked desperately at William, as if pleading for him to somehow rescue her from the situation. But William's expression remained impassive. He had given her multiple opportunities to tell the truth or gracefully retreat from her claims, and she had chosen instead to dig herself deeper into deception. "The truth is," William said finally, his voice carrying clearly to everyone in the group, "there was no trip to Kenya, no village, no wells, no beaded necklace from a grateful chief. 2 years ago, Camilla spent her summer attending social events in London, shopping, and hosting dinner parties." The reaction was immediate and devastating. Several guests gasped audibly, while others simply stared in shock. Lady Margaret's hand flew to her mouth, and Dr. Harrison shook his head with obvious disappointment. Camilla's face went through a final series of expressions, settling ultimately on a mask of cold fury directed entirely at William. "How dare you?" she said in a voice barely above a whisper, but trembling with rage. "How dare I tell the truth?" William replied calmly. "Or how dare I prevent you from taking advantage of good people's charitable intentions?" The confrontation was now fully in the open, and there would be no pretending it hadn't happened. The carefully maintained facade of family unity was cracking apart in front of some of the most influential people in British society. The tension in the small circle was palpable as Camilla and William faced each other across what felt like a vast chasm of broken trust and public humiliation. The other guests stood frozen, uncertain whether to flee the scene or stay to witness the unprecedented breakdown of royal protocol. "You have no idea what you've just done," Camilla hissed at William, her carefully maintained public persona finally cracking completely. "You've embarrassed the entire family." William let out a short, sharp laugh that cut through the air like a blade. "I've embarrassed the family? You just spent an hour lying to these good people about charitable work you never did, accepting their praise and their offers of financial support for a project that doesn't exist. And I'm the one who embarrassed the family?" Dr. Harrison stepped forward slightly, his medical training making him uncomfortable with the rising hostility. "Perhaps we should all take a moment to collect ourselves." "No," William said firmly, his eyes never leaving Camilla's face. "I think we've all collected ourselves quite enough. What we need now is honesty." Lady Margaret cleared her throat delicately. "Your Highness, I believe Dr. Harrison is right. This seems like a matter for private discussion." "It stopped being private the moment she started soliciting charitable donations based on lies," William replied. "Everyone here tonight deserves to know the truth." Camilla's composure was unraveling rapidly. "You sanctimonious little boy," she snapped. "You think you're so perfect, so righteous. You have no idea what it's like to constantly be judged, to have every word scrutinized. So you decided to make up a completely fictional story about helping impoverished children." William's voice rose slightly, drawing glances from other guests across the ballroom. "You thought the solution to scrutiny was to lie about charitable work in one of the most vulnerable regions of Africa?" "I was trying to inspire people," Camilla said desperately, "to encourage more charitable giving. The specific details don't matter if the end result is more help for those who need it." Dr. Harrison shook his head sadly. "But, Your Majesty, that's not how charitable work functions. These ladies and gentlemen were ready to commit real resources to a specific cause. When they discover the cause doesn't exist, it damages trust in all charitable endeavors." "Exactly," said Ambassador Reynolds, his diplomatic training making his tone measured but firm. "This kind of deception can have far-reaching consequences for legitimate humanitarian efforts." William watched as his stepmother's face cycled through emotions again, this time settling on a kind of petulant defiance. "Fine," she said, lifting her chin. "So I embellished a story. Politicians do it all the time. Authors do it. Everyone tells stories to make a point." "But you didn't present it as a story," Lady Margaret said, her voice heavy with disappointment. "You presented it as your personal experience. You accepted sympathy and admiration under false pretenses." Mrs. Williams, who had been silent during most of the confrontation, finally spoke up. "Your Majesty, I was prepared to write a substantial check tonight based on your story. How many others were planning similar donations?" Several other guests nodded or murmured agreement, and William could see the full scope of the deception beginning to dawn on everyone present. This wasn't just about wounded pride or family drama. It was about potential financial fraud, even if unintentional. Camilla seemed to realize the same thing, and her defiance crumbled into panic. "I never asked anyone for money," she said quickly. "I never directly solicited donations." "You accepted their offers of help," William pointed out. "You let them believe they would be supporting real ongoing work. That's solicitation, even if it's indirect." "You're twisting everything," Camilla accused, but her voice lacked conviction now. William felt a surge of something he hadn't expected. Genuine laughter. Not cruel laughter, but the kind that comes from recognizing absurdity. "I'm twisting everything?" "Camilla, you created an entire fictional humanitarian mission, complete with made-up villages and imaginary children calling you their guardian angel. I'm not twisting anything, I'm just refusing to pretend it's real." The laughter that had started as a small chuckle began to build as the full absurdity of the situation hit him. Here he was, the future King of England, standing in one of the most formal ballrooms in the world, exposing his stepmother's completely fabricated charitable adventures, while diplomats and socialites watched in horror. "This isn't funny," Camilla snapped. "Oh, but it is," William said, his laughter becoming more pronounced. "It's hilarious. You claim to sleep on dirt floors while spending your evenings on Egyptian cotton sheets. You talked about eating rice and beans, while your actual diet that summer consisted of champagne and caviar. You described the beautiful simplicity of village life while complaining about the thread count of hotel towels." Several other guests were now staring openly, drawn by the unusual sound of genuine laughter amid what had clearly been a serious confrontation. William's amusement seemed to be infectious, as Dr. Harrison struggled to suppress a smile, and even Lady Margaret's stern expression softened slightly. "You even," William continued through his laughter, "claim to have mediated disputes between families when you can't even mediate a disagreement between the kitchen staff about menu planning." "Stop it," Camilla demanded, but her authority was completely undermined by the surrounding atmosphere of barely contained amusement. "And the beaded necklace," William gasped between laughs. "The sacred necklace from the grateful village chief that you actually bought at a boutique in Notting Hill for £40 because you liked how ethnic it looked." At this point, Ambassador Reynolds couldn't contain a small snort of amusement, which set off Mrs. Williams, who began giggling despite herself. The entire group was being swept up in the infectious nature of William's laughter and the increasingly ridiculous details of Camilla's exposed fiction. "This is not appropriate," Camilla said desperately, but her protests only seemed to fuel the growing atmosphere of absurd humor. "You're right," William said, trying to control his laughter. "It's not appropriate. None of it is appropriate. It's not appropriate to lie about charitable work. It's not appropriate to exploit people's good intentions, and it's definitely not appropriate to claim you helped deliver babies when you faint at the sight of blood." The last detail proved to be the breaking point for several guests. Lady Margaret let out an undignified snort, followed immediately by a hand flying to cover her mouth in mortification. Dr. Harrison was openly grinning now, and Ambassador Reynolds had given up all pretense of diplomatic composure. "How dare you all laugh?" Camilla said, but her indignation only made the situation more comical. "How can we not laugh?" William asked, wiping tears from his eyes. "Camilla, you created the most elaborate fictional charity story in royal history, got caught by asking the wrong questions to the wrong people, and you're standing here acting like the victim. If this were a comedy sketch, no one would believe it was realistic enough." The group's laughter was now drawing attention from across the ballroom as other guests began to notice the unusual disturbance near the fireplace. Several people were beginning to drift over, curious about what could be causing such a reaction during such a formal event. "People are staring," Camilla said desperately. "Yes, they are," William agreed cheerfully. "And soon they'll all know the truth. The woman who spent an hour claiming to be a humanitarian hero actually spent that summer complaining about the air conditioning and demanding organic vegetables flown in from France." "I'm leaving," Camilla announced, turning to make a dignified exit. "Excellent idea," William called after her. "But you might want to consider making some charitable donations to actual Kenyan organizations on your way out. You know, to make up for all the fictional work you claim to have done." Camilla froze mid-step, her entire body rigid with fury. She turned back to face William one final time, her expression promising consequences he couldn't imagine. "This isn't over," she said in a voice so cold it could have frozen champagne. "Oh, I think it is," William replied, his laughter finally subsiding into a satisfied smile. "I think this particular story is very much over." As Camilla stormed away, her heels clicking angrily against the marble floor, the remaining group stood in stunned silence for a moment before the reality of what they had witnessed fully sank in. "Well," said Dr. Harrison finally, "that was certainly unexpected." "Unexpected is one word for it," Lady Margaret murmured, still looking slightly shocked by her own participation in the laughter. William looked around at the faces of the people who had witnessed Camilla's downfall and his own role in exposing her lies. He felt a complex mixture of satisfaction, relief, and anticipation of the consequences that would surely follow. "I suppose," he said to the group, "this will make for quite an interesting entry in tomorrow's society pages." Ambassador Reynolds cleared his throat diplomatically. "Your Highness, speaking for all of us, I think we can agree that discretion would be appreciated in how this evening's events are discussed." William nodded slowly. "Of course. Though I suspect the story will find its way out eventually, truth has a way of doing that." As the group began to disperse, each person processing what they had witnessed in their own way, William remained by the fireplace for a few moments longer. The crystal chandeliers continued to sparkle overhead. The string quartet played elegant classical pieces. And the charity gala proceeded with its important work of raising funds for legitimate causes. But something fundamental had changed. A line had been crossed that could never be uncrossed, and William knew that his relationship with his stepmother would never be the same. More importantly, the truth had finally been told, and whatever consequences followed, he was prepared to face them. The moment of Camilla's lies being exposed was over, but its aftermath would echo through the royal family for years to come. As William finally moved away from the fireplace to rejoin the broader festivities, he carried with him the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes, even in the most formal and protected environments, honesty could still prevail over deception. The charity gala continued around him, but he knew that, for better or worse, this would be the evening that would be remembered long after all the legitimate charitable work had been forgotten. The night when Prince William laughed while everyone watched his stepmother's carefully constructed lies crumble into dust.